James Stephen, a quiet elderly man with a calm and unassuming demeanor, stepped into a bustling car dealership on a chilly afternoon. His old sedan, while reliable, was nearly a decade old, and he decided it was time for an upgrade. Clad in a worn-out coat and scuff shoes, James looked entirely out of place amidst the sleek interiors in the well-dressed clientele. But he wasn't there to impress anyone. He was simply looking for a car that would meet his needs. As James wandered through the dealership admiring the gleaming vehicles on display, the reaction from the staff was far from welcoming. Despite his evident interest, no one approached him to offer assistance. Instead, the salespeople busy themselves with younger, flashy, or customers who looked like they could afford the dealership's luxury models. James's modest appearance seemed to act as an invisibility cloak, rendering him almost non-existent in the eyes of the staff. One of the salesmen, Carlos Peter, a young man with slick black hair and a self-assured smirk, briefly made eye contact with James. But just as quickly, he turned his attention to a well-dressed couple who had entered moments later. The whispers among the staff, the dismissive glances, and the palpable indifference were impossible to ignore. James waited patiently by a shiny black sedan that had caught his eye, running his hand along its polished surface and imagining himself behind the wheel. After nearly 20 minutes of being ignored, James decided to take matters into his own hands. He approached the main desk where 3 salesmen stood chatting animatedly. "Excuse me," he said politely, his voice steady despite the growing frustration in his chest. "I'm interested in purchasing one of your vehicles. Could someone assist me?" Carlos barely glanced up from his phone. "We're a bit busy at the moment," he replied dismissively. "Why don't you come back later?" James's expression remained calm, but inside a storm was brewing. He nodded curtly and turned to leave, his heart heavy with disappointment and anger. As he walked out, he heard one of the salesmen mutter under his breath, followed by a faint chuckle. "Wasting time on window shoppers," the voice sneered. Little did they know, James Stephen was far from an ordinary man. He had spent decades building a fortune through smart investments and business acumen. Yet he chose to live simply, valuing character over material possessions. The humiliation he felt that day would not be easily forgotten, and as he drove away in his old car, a plan began to take shape in his mind. That evening, James made a few phone calls to his influential contacts in the business world. By the next morning, he had orchestrated a move that would not only change his life, but also turn the dealership upside down. The following morning, James Stephen arrived at the dealership once more. This time, he wasn't there as a customer. After a series of strategic negotiations and phone calls the night before, James had secured the necessary funds and agreements to acquire the entire car dealership. As he stepped through the glass doors, the same staff who had ignored him the day before were present, completely unaware of the seismic shift that had occurred overnight. James was dressed the same. His modest coat and worn shoes didn't hint at the magnitude of the change. He walked in with the same quiet confidence, but this time, there was a spark of determination in his eyes. The dealership's general manager, a middle-aged man named David Bryn, noticed James immediately. Unaware of who he was or why he had returned, David put on a forced smile and approached him. "Good morning, sir," David said, his tone polite but insincere. "How can we assist you today?" James reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a neatly folded set of documents. Without a word, he handed them to David, watching his reaction closely. David's brows furrowed as he unfolded the papers and began to read. His face gradually turned pale. His confidence smiled, fading into an expression of disbelief and panic. "What is this?" David stammered, his voice unsteady. James finally broke his silence. "I'm not here to buy a car," he said calmly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm here as your new boss." The room fell silent as the weight of James's words sank in. The once dismissive sales staff began to notice the interaction. Their curiosity piqued. Whispered conversations broke out among them as they tried to piece together what was happening. David, still holding the papers with trembling hands, looked up at James with wide eyes. "This can't be right," David muttered. "You bought the dealership?" "That's correct," James replied, his tone firm but composed. "As of this morning, I own this operation, and I'm here to make some changes." The staff exchanged nervous glances. Those who had laughed at James the previous day now looked visibly uncomfortable. Carlos Peter, the slick-haired salesman who had dismissed James so callously, shifted uneasily in his spot, his smirk replaced with a look of dread. James turned to address the entire room. His voice, though measured, carried a quiet authority that demanded attention. "Yesterday I came here as a customer," he began. "I was looking to buy a car, but instead of being treated with respect, I was ignored, dismissed, and judged based solely on my appearance. You assumed I wasn't worth your time. You made a mistake." The tension in the room was palpable. No one dared to interrupt as James continued. "As of today, things are going to change when he declared, 'This dealership will no longer tolerate arrogance or discrimination of any kind. Every customer who walks through those doors will be treated with respect, regardless of how they look or what you think they can afford.'" He turned back to David. "And that starts with leadership. David, you're fired." David's jaw dropped. "Fired?" he echoed incredulously. "You can't be serious." "I'm very serious," James replied, his voice unwavering. "Your leadership has fostered a toxic culture here, and that ends now." The silence that followed was deafening. One by one, James began addressing the other staff members, calling out those who had displayed the same dismissive behavior he experienced. Carlos was among the first names on the list. "Carlos Peter," James said, his gaze locking onto the young salesman. Carlos Peter, unable to meet James's eyes. "You showed me exactly the kind of attitude this dealership will no longer tolerate. Pack your things." Carlos opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He knew there was no use arguing. With his head down, he walked toward the back office together, his belongings. As Carlos shuffled away, James continued his appraisal of the staff. Those who had sneered or whispered about him the day before were either dismissed or warned that their behavior needed to change immediately. James wasn't just firing people for the sake of revenge. He was building a team that reflected the values he held dear: respect, humility, and kindness. Among the group, one employee stood out, a young woman named Chloe Smith. Unlike her colleagues, Chloe had discreetly greeted James the previous day and even offered a warm smile, though she hadn't been assigned to sales. James remembered her small act of kindness and saw potential in her. "Chloe Smith," James called out, and she stepped forward nervously. "You're one of the few people here who treated me with even a shred of decency. Starting today, you'll be the new floor manager. I trust you'll lead with fairness and respect." Chloe's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? But I've only been here 6 months," she stammered. "I'm not interested in seniority," James replied. "I'm interested in people who treat others the right way." "Congratulations, Chloe." The remaining staff, now visibly shaken, began to realize that James wasn't there to simply punish. He was there to rebuild. He addressed the room once more, his voice calm but resolute. "This dealership will no longer operate as it has in the past," he declared. "I want each of you to understand that every customer matters. Whether they're dressed in a 3-piece suit or an old coat like mine, they deserve your full attention and respect. If you can't uphold those values, there's no place for you here." By the end of the day, nearly half the staff had been dismissed. Those who remained were given clear instructions on how the dealership would operate moving forward. James wasted no time hiring replacements, prioritizing individuals who shared his vision for a respectful and inclusive workplace. The transformation of the dealership was swift. Word spread quickly about the dramatic events in the new ownership. Customers began to notice the difference almost immediately. Where arrogance and indifference had once prevailed, a welcoming and professional atmosphere now thrived. Within weeks, sales soared, and the dealership's reputation skyrocketed. People from all over the city came not just to buy cars, but to experience the exceptional service that had become the dealership's hallmark. James, however, remained as modest as ever. He didn't bask in the attention or take credit for the turnaround. For him, it wasn't about proving a point to the staff who had dismissed him. It was about creating something meaningful, a place where people felt valued. One afternoon, as James walked through the showroom, now bustling with activity, Chloe approached him. "Mr. Stephen," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you for believing in me and giving me this opportunity." James smiled warmly. "You earned it, Chloe. All I did was recognize what was already there. Just remember to keep treating people the way you always have, with respect. That's what truly matters." Chloe nodded, her confidence growing with each passing day. Under her leadership in James's guidance, the dealership flourished. As James prepared to leave the showroom, he took one last look around. The same space that had once been filled with indifference and condescension was now alive with positivity and purpose. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from the power he now wielded, but from the change he had brought about. This experience had been a reminder that true wealth wasn't about money or possessions. It was about how you treated others and the impact you made on the world. Andrew Myers had proven that humility and kindness could triumph over arrogance, and in doing so he left an indelible mark not only on the dealership, but on everyone who crossed its doors.